Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of How History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time Early was given command of Confederate forces in the Shenandoah Valley. Now he sets his eyes on Washington, D.C. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, or purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Jubal Early's presence in the Union caused panic throughout the North and in Washington, D.C. President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, called for Ulysses S. Grant to send troops, and he also called on northern states to supply 100-day recruits to help protect the capital. Grant, only now believing that Robert E. Lee could divert significant numbers of troops from his army, offered to send an entire corps from the Army of the Potomac. Henry Halleck, the chief of staff in Washington, told Grant that an entire corps wasn't necessary, so Grant dispatched part of the 6th Corps, with the rest of the Corps coming at a later date. The Union commander of the Middle Department, with his headquarters in Baltimore, Maryland, was Major General Lew Wallace. The Union commander pushed west to confront Early's force just to the east of Frederick, Maryland. Early moved through the Catoctin Mountains with a force of about 14,000 men, greatly outnumbering Wallace's force of only about 5,000. Upon entering Frederick and driving away its Union defenders, Early again requested a contribution from its townspeople, asking for $200,000. The leaders of the town begged Early to give them more time to come up with the money, which Early granted. On July 9, 1864, Early's troops collided with Wallace's at the Battle of Monocacy. The Union troops put up a stubborn stand against the numerically superior Confederates, until Early was able to find his way around the Union flank and sent the Federals into a retreat. However, even though it was a Union defeat, it delayed Early's troops for about a day, a significant amount of time. This delay would allow for Union troops from Grant's forces and other troops being sent from elsewhere to come guard the capital. As Early got closer to Washington, word spread throughout that he carried with him 50,000 veteran troops and was bent on taking over the city. The numbers were completely exaggerated, but his show of force at Monocacy and his determination of march made the Northern public see his force as much larger than it was. Early took the small force at Monocacy to mean that the capital was largely undefended, and pushed off with a vigor toward Washington, heading out early on the next day, on July 10th. By dawn of July 11th, Early and his men were about a day's march away, and he planned to be at the city's outskirts by nightfall. Another part of Early's plan was to free the Confederate prisoners at Point Lookout and use them to augment his forces. He hoped that when released, they could make it to him in time. Although the force opposing Early was smaller, they did have the benefit of a system of fortifications designed to defend the city. Grant sent the remainder of the 6th Corps to Washington and also began sending the 19th Corps, fresh from its ill-fated Red River campaign in Louisiana. With all those reinforcements, the Union could only muster around 11,000 men, but could those arrive in time to stop Early? Just a handful of regiments were on hand to defend the city as Early approached. The debilitating heat and the arduous march by Early had depleted his ranks. Just a couple thousand men were able to attack the fortifications if Early ordered them to do so. Confederate cavalry dismounted and began probing the works, and Early could see that the enemy was mostly militia, but Robert Rodes's division would need to come up to launch the attack, and it was a good distance away. So, Early waited, but as he waited, he could see dust clouds rise and blue uniformed reinforcements enter the ramparts and trenches in front of him, consisting of Fort Stevens and the works that reinforced it. As one of Early's biographers wrote, here was the Valley Army which Lee had risked losing Richmond to detach for this foray in front of the enemy's capital. Considering Lee's gamble, the hundreds of miles marched, and the casualties at the Monocacy, was the army now, like Hunter at Lynchburg, odious thought, to slink away in the night without even trying to grasp the prize? Jubal's wrathful soul rejected the very idea. On the other hand, in his cooler soldier's thoughts, he had asked himself how the thing was to be done. Lee would scarcely thank him for losing his army by reckless action. Early knew the defenses were strong, but he knew far too little of the strength manning them. Early left Rodes to fight the Battle of Fort Stevens, which was a fight that involved skirmishing, long-range marksmanship, and artillery fire, but no major attack. Early himself went a few miles to the rear to Silver Spring to the house of influential politician Francis P. Blair. Blair had been a supporter of Andrew Jackson and the Democratic Party, but split with that party and helped organize the Republican Party in the 1850s. He was the man that offered Robert E. Lee the command of a Union army before Lee officially sided with the Confederacy. He was also an advisor to Abraham Lincoln and promoted his two sons' abilities, Francis P. Blair, Jr., who was now a corps commander in the Army of the Tennessee as that army worked its way toward Atlanta, and his other son, Montgomery Blair, who was in Lincoln's cabinet. That fateful day, the elder Blair was in Pennsylvania on a fishing trip, so Early took over his home and made it the headquarters of the Army of the Valley. That night, Early called together his division commanders, John Brown Gordon, Robert Rhodes, John C. Breckinridge, and Stephen Ramseur. They sampled the wine from Blair's wine cellar and discussed what the next course of action would be. Reports began coming in that not only was the 6th Corps reinforcing the city, but the 19th Corps was also on its way. Early believed that attacking one corps would be hard enough, but with two on their way, attacking the city would be foolhardy. He rode out early the next morning on July 12th to take a look at the Union defenses and saw more dust clouds rising, and decided the best thing to do was to keep up heavy skirmishing, then pull back under the cover of darkness. At 6 p.m., a brigade of Union infantry under Daniel Bidwell came out from their defenses and began attacking Rhodes's infantry, which threw back the blue attackers. Early then began pulling his army back. Being in front of Washington for 2 days had only resulted in about 100 casualties, and it had given the Northern public and Washingtonians a scare, diverting thousands upon thousands of Union troops from Grant's army around Richmond. It may have been a disappointment to Early, but he had performed a valuable service to Lee. The retreat back into Virginia was done with little threat from Union troops, which didn't mount a pursuit for basically a whole day, allowing Early to slip across the Potomac River with little harassment. The Southern papers heralded Early's invasion of Maryland and anticipated great things, but the withdrawal from the outskirts of Washington deflated their hopes. Many began to blame Early and heavily criticize him, but as one of Early's biographers noted, Early didn't care what the papers said. He cared about what Lee thought, and Lee was happy with Early's progress. Years later, a friend of Early's recounted what the invasion had accomplished. It reads in part, Early drove 18,000 troops under David Hunter out of the valley, immobilized 6,000 men at Harper's Ferry, defeated Lew Wallace at Monocacy, and diverted parts of 2 corps from Grant's principal theater of operation around Petersburg. Amidst the campaign, Early's Army of the Valley amazingly marched between June 13th and July 14th 510 miles, averaging 16 miles a day. All in all, Early had done an excellent job. Early now suggested to Lee that he should return to the Army of Northern Virginia, but Lee had other plans. The wheat crop in the valley was supposed to be the largest in years, and if Union forces occupied it, then there would be less food coming into the Confederate bastions of Richmond and Petersburg. Thus, Early needed to stay in the valley to protect the wheat crop and still divert attention and manpower from Grant's army. Grant was tired of having to deal with Early and his army. Early's presence so close to Washington prevented him from aggressively campaigning against Petersburg, but he didn't want to leave Early in the valley without a force to either defeat him or harass him. Grant ordered David Hunter, now at Harper's Ferry, to press Early vigorously. He told Hunter, make all the valley south of the B&O a desert, as high up as possible. I do not mean that houses should be burned, but every particle of provisions and stock should be removed, and the people notified to move out. Grant ordered Hunter's men to eat out Virginia, clear and clean, as far as they go, so that crows flying over it for the balance of this season will have to carry their provender with them. Hunter would ignore the order not to burn dwellings. The day he got Grant's order, he burned the home of his first cousin, Andrew Hunter, who prosecuted John Brown in 1859 on behalf of the United States. Then he ordered the burning of the home of Edwin J. Lee, one of Robert E. Lee's distant cousins, and the home where Hunter's own niece was welcome as a refugee. Miss Edmund Lee wrote a scathing letter to Hunter. It said, Hyena-like you have torn my heart to pieces, and demon-like you have done it without a pretext of revenge, for I never saw or harmed you. No prayer can be offered you. Were it possible for human lips to raise your name heavenward, angels would thrust the foul thing back again. These acts only hardened Early's hatred for the Union armies. He wrote, I now came to the conclusion that we had stood the mode of warfare long enough, and that it was now time to open the eyes of the people of the North to its enormity by an example in the way of retaliation. The fight for the Shenandoah Valley was now set. Union forces were determined to ravage the valley to prevent its sustenance from getting to Lee's army, and Confederate forces under Early were set to defend the valley from further encroachment by Federal forces. Now, too, Early had a vendetta against the Union troops, who were now making war against civilians and driving them from their homes. He hoped to end that type of warfare, or at the very least, make the Northern populace feel the Southern civilians' pain.